In the summer of 1864, the American Civil War had dragged into its fourth bloody year, and both the Union and the Confederacy were weary from the endless slaughter that had already claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. The war that had begun with promises of a short and decisive struggle had transformed into a grinding conflict of attrition. By this stage, the Union held many advantages in population, industry, and resources, but the Confederacy fought with stubborn determination, believing that if it could simply hold out long enough, the North would lose its will to continue. Against this backdrop, General Ulysses S. Grant, newly appointed as General-in-Chief of all Union armies, developed a bold strategy to bring the war to a swift and decisive end. Central to that plan was William Tecumseh Sherman, the man who would carry out one of the most daring and consequential campaigns in American military history, the March on Atlanta. Grant understood the grim mathematics of war better than most. His experience at Shiloh, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga had shown him that Confederate forces, while often skillful and determined, could be worn down if pressed hard and relentlessly. The Union had the manpower and material to sustain heavy losses in a way the South could not. His strategy for 1864 was not about seeking one glorious battle that would end the war at a stroke. Instead, he designed a campaign of simultaneous offensives that would stretch Confederate resources to the breaking point. The Army of the Potomac under his direct supervision would pin down Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in a brutal war of attrition in Virginia, while Sherman would take command of the Western Theater with the mission of driving deep into the Confederate heartland. His target was Atlanta, the industrial and rail hub of the Deep South, a city whose capture would cripple Confederate logistics and deliver a devastating blow to Southern morale. Sherman was the right man for such a task. Brilliant, unconventional, and sometimes controversial, he had proven himself at Shiloh and during the Chattanooga campaign. He was both feared and respected by his soldiers, and his understanding of the broader nature of war went beyond tactics and battles. Sherman believed that war was not only fought between armies but also involved the destruction of the enemy's will and capacity to resist. He did not relish destruction, but he understood that breaking the backbone of the Confederacy required not only defeating its soldiers but also striking at its resources, its infrastructure, and its very ability to sustain war. Atlanta, with its factories, railroads, and supplies, symbolized the lifeblood of the Confederacy. If Atlanta fell, it would signal that the South's capacity to continue the fight was fatally compromised. In May of 1864, Sherman began his campaign with approximately 100,000 Union soldiers, organized into three armies under George Thomas, James McPherson, and John Schofield. Opposing them was General Joseph E. Johnston with about 60,000 Confederate troops. Johnston was a cautious commander, known for his defensive skill and reluctance to risk large battles. He aimed to delay and exhaust Sherman's forces through maneuver and fortifications, buying time in the hope that Northern public opinion would turn against the war effort, particularly with a presidential election looming in November. Sherman, however, was relentless. He advanced southward from Chattanooga, using flanking maneuvers to push Johnston out of one defensive position after another, from Rocky Face Ridge to Resaca, from New Hope Church to Kennesaw Mountain. Each time, Johnston skillfully avoided a decisive defeat, retreating to new positions, but Sherman kept pressing forward, edging closer and closer to Atlanta. The campaign was grueling. The terrain of northern Georgia was rugged, filled with forests, hills, and rivers that made maneuvering armies difficult. The heat of summer, the constant marching, and the frequent skirmishes took their toll on the soldiers. Casualties mounted on both sides. At Kennesaw Mountain in late June, Sherman made the mistake of ordering a frontal assault against fortified Confederate positions, suffering heavy losses. But he learned from the experience and quickly reverted to his preferred strategy of maneuvering around his enemy's flanks, forcing Johnston to retreat once more. Slowly but surely, Sherman tightened the noose around Atlanta. By mid-July, President Jefferson Davis had grown frustrated with Johnston's continual withdrawals. Believing that Johnston's caution was surrendering too much territory without a fight, Davis replaced him with General John Bell Hood, a young and aggressive commander known for his boldness but also for his recklessness. Hood immediately sought to take the offensive, launching attacks against Sherman's forces in a desperate attempt to drive them back. At Peachtree Creek, the Battle of Atlanta, and Ezra Church, Hood's attacks resulted in fierce fighting but ended in bloody repulses. The Confederates suffered heavy casualties, losses they could ill afford. Sherman, meanwhile, continued to extend his lines, cutting off railroads and supply routes that sustained the city. By late August, Sherman executed a daring move that sealed Atlanta's fate. He sent troops under General Howard to swing around south of the city and cut the last major railroad at Jonesboro. Hood had no choice but to abandon Atlanta. On September 2, 1864, Union troops entered the city, capturing one of the Confederacy's most vital strongholds. The fall of Atlanta was not only a military triumph but also a political earthquake. At that very moment, President Abraham Lincoln faced a difficult re-election campaign. Northern morale had been sinking after years of bloody stalemate, and many doubted Lincoln's leadership. The Democratic candidate, George McClellan, ran on a platform that hinted at negotiating peace with the Confederacy. Without a major victory, Lincoln's chances of re-election looked bleak. But the capture of Atlanta electrified the North. It revived hope, boosted confidence in the Union cause, and secured Lincoln's re-election in November, ensuring that the war would be fought to its conclusion rather than settled by compromise. The significance of Sherman's success cannot be overstated. By taking Atlanta, he not only crippled the Confederacy's war-making capacity but also shifted the political balance of the entire conflict. But Sherman was not finished. After evacuating the civilians of Atlanta, he ordered the destruction of military facilities, factories, and railroads in the city. His philosophy of hard war was becoming clearer. He understood that breaking the Confederacy required more than winning battles. It required destroying the South's ability to wage war at all. From Atlanta, Sherman embarked on his infamous March to the Sea, a campaign of devastation that cut through Georgia, targeting infrastructure, farms, and resources that sustained the Confederate war effort. His march would further erode Southern morale and hasten the war's end. Grant's grand strategy of coordinated offensives in 1864 came at terrible cost. The fighting in Virginia, from the Wilderness to Cold Harbor, inflicted horrific casualties, and the siege of Petersburg would drag on for months. But the strategy worked. Confederate armies were forced to fight continuously, unable to regroup or replenish their strength. Sherman's capture of Atlanta demonstrated the effectiveness of attacking the Confederacy on multiple fronts, preventing it from concentrating its forces. It showed that while Lee could defend in Virginia, he could not save Atlanta, and without Atlanta, the Confederacy's survival became far less likely. The campaign also revealed the deep synergy between Grant and Sherman. The two generals shared a vision of total war, of pressing the enemy simultaneously and without respite, of using the Union's overwhelming resources to grind down the Confederacy. They trusted one another deeply. Grant gave Sherman broad authority in the West, confident that he would achieve results, while Sherman respected Grant's leadership and carried out his part of the strategy with relentless determination. Their partnership proved decisive in bringing the war to an end. For the soldiers who marched with Sherman, the Atlanta campaign was a test of endurance and resilience. They marched through sweltering heat, through rain and mud, through endless skirmishes and battles. They saw comrades fall and endured the exhaustion of constant campaigning. But they also witnessed victories that gave them a sense of purpose. The capture of Atlanta felt like vindication for all the sacrifices they had made. For many, it symbolized the beginning of the end of the Confederacy. For the people of Atlanta, the campaign brought devastation. The city endured bombardments, shortages, and finally evacuation and destruction. Civilians were forced from their homes, watching as Union soldiers tore up railroads, burned supplies, and dismantled factories. To them, the war was no longer distant. It had come directly to their doorsteps. The suffering was immense, but it underscored the harsh reality that war consumed not only armies but entire societies. In the larger scope of history, Sherman's march on Atlanta stands as one of the turning points of the Civil War. It illustrated the power of strategic vision, the importance of logistics and maneuver, and the impact of military success on political outcomes. It also marked a transition toward the modern concept of total war, where the distinction between combatants and the society that sustained them blurred. Sherman's methods were controversial and remain debated to this day, but they were undeniably effective in hastening the collapse of the Confederacy. By the time 1864 ended, the Confederacy was reeling. Atlanta had fallen, Sherman was marching to the sea, and Grant kept Lee pinned in Virginia. The Union's momentum was unstoppable. The war would last only a few more months before the final surrender at Appomattox in April 1865. And when historians look back, they see the summer of 1864, with Grant's bold strategy and Sherman's relentless drive, as the moment when the war's outcome was effectively decided. The legacy of Sherman's march on Atlanta is woven into the fabric of American memory. For the Union, it was a story of determination, sacrifice, and eventual triumph. For the Confederacy, it was a tale of loss, destruction, and the realization that their cause was doomed. For the nation as a whole, it was a defining moment in the struggle to preserve the Union and end the institution of slavery. The fall of Atlanta was not just the capture of a city, it was the breaking of the Confederate heart, the signal that the tide of war had irrevocably turned. Grant's 1864 grand strategy. When Ulysses S. Grant was appointed General-in-Chief of all Union armies in March 1864, he recognized that the war had become a struggle of attrition. The Confederacy, though smaller and less industrially capable, had managed to resist because Union offensives had often been piecemeal, allowing the South to shift forces where needed. Grant's solution was a bold, coordinated grand strategy. He ordered simultaneous offensives across multiple theaters. He himself would engage Robert E. Lee in Virginia, while William T. Sherman would advance into Georgia, and other Union forces would press in Tennessee and the Gulf. The logic was simple. If the Confederacy was attacked everywhere at once, it could not reinforce one front without weakening another. This relentless pressure would prevent the South from regaining the initiative and would stretch its manpower and resources to breaking. It was not about one decisive battle, but about constant, grinding pressure until collapse. Sherman chosen as Western commander. Grant's choice of William Tecumseh Sherman to lead the Western campaign was not accidental. The two men shared a deep bond forged through years of war and mutual respect. Sherman had proven himself at Shiloh, where his stubborn defense saved the Union line, and later at Vicksburg and Chattanooga, where his aggressive maneuvers contributed to major victories. Grant valued Sherman's strategic mind, his ability to manage large armies, and his willingness to embrace the harsh realities of war. Sherman was not universally loved. His blunt manner and sometimes unconventional ideas made him controversial, but Grant trusted him completely. Their relationship was one of the great partnerships of the war. While Grant focused on grinding down Lee in Virginia, he gave Sherman broad authority to operate in Georgia. Sherman's mission was clear: break the Confederate hold on the Deep South by capturing Atlanta, a city whose loss would resonate far beyond the battlefield. Atlanta as the key target. Atlanta was more than just another southern city, it was a vital hub of the Confederacy's war machine. Its railroads linked the Deep South with Virginia and the Western Theater, carrying supplies, weapons, and reinforcements. Its factories produced ammunition, equipment, and war materials. Its warehouses stored precious supplies. To Union strategists, Atlanta represented the beating heart of the Southern logistical network. Capturing it would cripple Confederate supply lines and send a psychological shock through the South. For the Confederacy, defending Atlanta was paramount. Losing it would mean not only the destruction of vital infrastructure but also a devastating blow to civilian morale. It was a symbol of Southern endurance. This was why Grant made it the centerpiece of Sherman's campaign. Sherman himself understood that the war was no longer about capturing territory for its own sake, it was about striking at the South's capacity to sustain the fight. Atlanta became the prize. Sherman's 100,000 vs. Johnston's 60,000. When Sherman began his campaign in May 1864, he commanded a formidable force of around 100,000 men, organized into three major armies under Generals George Thomas, James McPherson, and John Schofield. Opposing him was Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston with about 60,000 soldiers. On paper, Sherman had the advantage in numbers and resources, but Johnston had the benefit of terrain and defensive skill. Northern Georgia was rugged, filled with ridges, rivers, and forests that favored defenders. Johnston was cautious by nature, often preferring to dig in behind strong fortifications rather than risk open battle. His goal was not to defeat Sherman outright but to delay and wear him down, forcing the Union Army to bleed itself against fortified lines. With fewer troops to spare, Johnston needed to fight a defensive campaign. Sherman's challenge was to outmaneuver him and force him into situations where retreat was the only option. Sherman's flanking maneuvers. Sherman understood that frontal assaults against entrenched positions were costly and often futile. Instead, he relied on his mastery of maneuver. Time and again during the Atlanta campaign, he feigned Frontal attacks to keep Johnston pinned in place while sending forces around the flanks to threaten Confederate supply lines or rear positions. This forced Johnston to retreat rather than risk being surrounded. From Rocky Face Ridge to Resaca, from Dallas to Marietta, Sherman used these maneuvers to steadily push the Confederates southward. Each time Johnston withdrew, the Union Army crept closer to Atlanta. The campaign became a slow but steady dance, with Sherman refusing to give Johnston the opportunity to fight on ground of his choosing. While this method frustrated some soldiers who longed for a decisive battle, it minimized Union casualties and ensured steady progress toward the ultimate objective. Sherman's patience proved his greatest weapon. Kennesaw Mountain mistake. One of the bloodiest lessons of the campaign came at Kennesaw Mountain in late June 1864. Frustrated by weeks of maneuvering and heavy rains that slowed his advance, Sherman ordered a direct assault on Johnston's heavily fortified lines. The result was disastrous. Union troops were cut down in droves as they charged uphill into entrenched Confederate positions. The attack achieved nothing but heavy losses, with thousands of Union soldiers killed or wounded in a matter of hours. Sherman admitted the assault had been a mistake, but he quickly adapted. Rather than repeating the error, he reverted to his flanking tactics, once again forcing Johnston to abandon his lines. Kennesaw Mountain stood as a grim reminder of the cost of underestimating well-prepared defenses. It also showed Sherman's flexibility. He learned from failure, adjusted his approach, and refused to be drawn into repeated bloodletting assaults that could sap his strength before Atlanta. Davis replaces Johnston with Hood. As Sherman pressed closer to Atlanta, Confederate President Jefferson Davis grew increasingly impatient with Johnston's constant retreats. Though Johnston's strategy of delay had preserved his army, it had surrendered hundreds of miles of Georgia without a decisive stand. Southern morale was sinking, and Davis feared that continued withdrawals would doom Atlanta. In July, he made the fateful decision to replace Johnston with General John Bell Hood. Hood was young, aggressive, and personally brave, but he was also reckless. Unlike Johnston, who prioritized preserving his army, Hood believed in taking the fight directly to the enemy, regardless of odds. Davis hoped Hood's aggressiveness would inspire the troops and save Atlanta through bold counterattacks. Instead, the decision exposed the Confederate army to devastating defeats. The change in leadership marked a turning point. Where Johnston had tried to fight with caution and patience, Hood's style would bring destruction to his already outnumbered forces. Hood's failed counterattacks. Once in command, General Hood immediately launched a series of offensives against Sherman's forces, hoping to drive them back from Atlanta. At Peachtree Creek on July 20th, he hurled his men against Thomas's Army of the Cumberland, only to be repulsed with heavy losses. Just 2 days later, in the Battle of Atlanta, Hood struck at McPherson's Army of the Tennessee. The fighting was fierce, and McPherson himself was killed, but the Union lines held firm. At Ezra Church, Hood again attacked, only to be beaten back. These repeated assaults cost the Confederates thousands of men they could not replace. While Hood sought to demonstrate boldness, the reality was that his army was bleeding itself to death in futile offensives. Sherman, meanwhile, absorbed the blows and continued tightening his grip on the city. Hood's aggressiveness, rather than saving Atlanta, accelerated its downfall by squandering precious Confederate strength. Sherman cuts the railroads. Sherman knew that Atlanta could not survive without its rail connections. The city depended on railroads for supplies, reinforcements, and communication with the rest of the Confederacy. Recognizing this, Sherman extended his lines to the west and south, targeting the vital rail lines that fed into Atlanta. Union forces tore up tracks, burned bridges, and destroyed supply depots. By late August, Sherman launched a daring maneuver. He sent General Howard's forces to swing south and seize the Macon and Western Railroad at Jonesboro, the last major line supplying the city. Hood recognized the danger and launched counterattacks, but they failed. With his supply lines severed, Hood had no choice but to abandon Atlanta. Sherman's focus on logistics, rather than simply capturing territory, proved decisive. By destroying the arteries that sustained the Confederate defense, he forced Hood into retreat without needing to storm the city directly. Fall of Atlanta, September 2, 1864. On September 1, 1864, Hood ordered the evacuation of Atlanta. Explosions rocked the city as Confederate forces destroyed supplies and munitions to keep them from falling into Union hands. The next day, Union troops marched into the city. Sherman had achieved his great objective, the capture of Atlanta. For the Union, it was a moment of triumph. Soldiers cheered, newspapers hailed the victory, and Northern civilians celebrated the long-awaited good news. For the Confederacy, the loss of Atlanta was catastrophic. The city's fall shattered morale, cut vital supply lines, and symbolized the crumbling of the Southern war effort. Sherman telegraphed Lincoln with the famous message, "Atlanta is ours, and fairly won." That simple line carried immense weight. The campaign that had stretched over months of marching, fighting, and maneuvering culminated in one of the most significant victories of the war, a victory that reshaped its course. Impact on Northern morale in Lincoln's election. Perhaps the greatest impact of the fall of Atlanta was political. In the summer of 1864, Abraham Lincoln's chances of re-election looked bleak. The war had dragged on with horrific losses, and many in the North were weary of the bloodshed. His opponent, George McClellan, ran on a Democratic platform that hinted at negotiating peace with the Confederacy. If Lincoln lost, the Union might abandon its war effort before victory was achieved. But the capture of Atlanta changed everything. It revived Northern morale and gave Lincoln a powerful argument that the war could be won. Public opinion swung in his favor, and in November, he was decisively re-elected. This ensured that the war would continue until unconditional Union victory. Without Atlanta, Lincoln might have lost, and the war might have ended in compromise. With Atlanta, the Union gained not only a battlefield triumph but also a political mandate for total victory. Civilian evacuation and destruction. After capturing Atlanta, Sherman made a controversial decision. He ordered the evacuation of the city's civilian population. Families were forced to leave, many with only what they could carry, as Union troops prepared to turn the city into a military base. Sherman believed that civilians would only consume supplies and potentially aid Confederate forces. He also authorized the systematic destruction of military facilities, railroads, factories, and warehouses. Buildings were burned, tracks were torn up and twisted, and vast amounts of infrastructure were rendered useless. For civilians, the experience was traumatic, leaving them homeless and destitute. For Sherman, it was a harsh necessity of war. By destroying Atlanta's military value, he ensured it could not be used again by the Confederacy. This policy of hard war foreshadowed the even more destructive March to the Sea, where Sherman would carry the principle of total war deeper into Georgia. Beginning of the March to the Sea. With Atlanta secured, Sherman turned to his next move, one that would make his name infamous in Southern memory. In November 1864, he began the March to the Sea, leading 60,000 men on a campaign of destruction across Georgia to Savannah. The goal was not to fight Confederate armies directly but to break the South's will to fight by destroying its resources. His men tore up railroads, burned crops, seized livestock, and demolished infrastructure. It was war carried into the heart of civilian life, designed to make Georgians feel the cost of secession firsthand. Sherman famously declared that he would make Georgia howl. The march horrified many but proved brutally effective. It crippled Confederate logistics, undermined civilian morale, and demonstrated the Union's ability to move unopposed through the South. Atlanta had been the beginning, but the March to the Sea would become the embodiment of Sherman's philosophy of total war. Effectiveness of Grant-Sherman partnership. The success of the Atlanta campaign also underscored the unique partnership between Grant and Sherman. Unlike many generals who had clashed with political leaders or fellow officers, Grant and Sherman shared a deep mutual trust. Grant provided the overall vision and strategy, while Sherman executed it with energy and creativity. Grant did not micromanage Sherman. Instead, he gave him freedom to act as he saw fit. Sherman, in turn, respected Grant's authority and never sought to undermine him. This partnership stood in stark contrast to the fractured leadership on the Confederate side, where Davis often quarreled with his generals. Grant and Sherman both understood that the Union's overwhelming resources had to be applied relentlessly and simultaneously to wear down the South. Their unity of purpose ensured that the Union effort remained coordinated and effective, a key factor in bringing about eventual victory in the Civil War. Turning point of the Civil War. The fall of Atlanta marked a true turning point in the Civil War. Before its capture, the conflict seemed endless, with neither side gaining decisive momentum. After Atlanta, the balance shifted irrevocably. The Confederacy lost a vital industrial hub, suffered irreparable damage to its logistics, and faced a collapse in morale. The Union, meanwhile, gained renewed confidence and political strength. Lincoln's re-election guaranteed that the North would fight on until victory, rather than negotiate peace. Sherman's campaign showed the power of total war and foreshadowed the final months of relentless Union offensives. Within 7 months of Atlanta's fall, Lee would surrender at Appomattox, and the Confederacy would cease to exist. Historians often point to September 1864 as the moment when the war's outcome was sealed. Atlanta was not just a military victory, it was the symbolic and strategic blow that marked the beginning of the end for the Confederacy.